Hello everyone, and welcome back to another lecture video for the course of Web and Mobile Systems for winter 2023 semester. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about a little bit on the background of this course, what are the different aspects that are involved, as well as the topics that we are going to be specifically covering during the next 3.5 to 4 months for this semester. So first and foremost, when it comes to web development, it can be broken down into two different tiers. Okay, the first tier is known as front-end development, and the second tier is known as back-end development. Okay, so when you are developing front ends, okay, you are generally responsible for developing client-facing websites or user interfaces or APIs, as we like to call it, right? And the different technologies that are out there, which we generally make use of in order to develop these front-end UIs, are in the form of hypertext markup languages, which is also better known as HTML, cascading style sheets, which is CSS, JavaScript, and then another version of JavaScript, which is a little bit more stricter, that is known as TypeScript. And then in order to optimize the process of development, we have the availability of different JavaScript frameworks, which we're going to talk about in a little bit time. And then we also need to learn about what is known as the document object model. Essentially, that is the structure of all of the UIs that these web systems have, or even these mobile systems have to a certain degree. And then learn a little bit about how the HTTP request response cycle works in order to make UIs that can connect with back-end applications. Okay, and following that queue, the second tier, which is backend development, essentially is responsible for developing server APIs, okay, or backend APIs, as we like to call it. And the main focus of developers when it comes to backend development is essentially the management and modeling of data that is going to be handled, and then creating endpoints that can be accessed by the front-end APIs that either the front-end developers have developed or you have developed as a backend developer as well, right? So whenever you mix the tasks of front-end development and backend development together, that is, you yourself are responsible for developing both of these different tiers, then that is known as a full stack developer, okay, or a full stack developer. So essentially, these are the three different types of web developers that are out there, right? So somebody who is specifically responsible for developing client-facing user interfaces, which is the front-end development, somebody who is responsible for managing and modeling the data and then creating resources that can be then later on accessed by other front ends, that is known as backend development. And anybody who is responsible for both of these tasks, they are known as full stack developers. So when it comes to the fundamentals of front-end development, the two important technologies that are out there is HTML and CSS. Okay, you use HTML, and HTML5 is the most recent version of HTML. Okay, to structure your pages, your web pages, and then use meaningful tags, which are also otherwise known as semantic tags, to make sure that what you're developing, when it is translated by assistive devices, right? So for example, those who have difficulty and challenges with respect to seeing, right? They have visual impairments and stuff like that. They generally use these readout devices that essentially is responsible for reading out, translating the web page, the UI that you have designed, and then reading out the contents of those web pages back to its user, right? So if you do not develop these UIs using meaningful tags, right, then it will not make sense to these users. So this pertains to the domain of accessibility. So essentially, if you want to make your web pages accessible across your user base, right, and not just make it visual, then you have to learn how to use semantic tags, all right? And then once you have taken care of structuring, the next part of the UI design or UI development is basically styling or presentation. So we use the technology of CSS, where we are kind of concerned about how to position our different UI elements on the page, how to align them with respect to the margins that are there, how to incorporate different simplistic transitions and animations on the web page, and how to make it responsive, right? And what we mean by responsive and responsive designs are basically supported by media queries that we write within the CSS technology. Is, let's say if you design a web system, right, and that is being accessed by a desktop versus that is being accessed by a tablet, right, or an iPad, or it is being accessed by a cell phone, which has a different screen size. So how do you ensure that regardless what kind of screens or device width and length is accessing your front-end UI, it does not break down, right? That the presentation remains consistent depending on the type of devices that is accessing those particular UI. So that is known as responsive design, okay? And the responsive design is kind of implemented with the help of media queries that pertains to a specific concept, that is a concept that is specific to CSS, right? So these are basically the fundamental of any front-end development, right? So if you're specifically for web systems, it changes a little bit when we are going to talk about mobile development or mobile front-end UI development. But mostly for web systems, we use HTML and CSS. Okay. In addition to that, once you have learned the basics of CSS with respect to what its syntax are, what are its basic concepts, what are its basic semantics and stuff like that, you can choose to optimize the process of implementation of your development by selecting one of the CSS frameworks that are available at your disposal, right? So some of the examples, some of the well-known examples that are out there are like Tailwind CSS, then you have Bootstrap, Materialize is there from Google, and then Bulma is there and stuff like that, right? So once you learn the fundamentals of CSS, in order to optimize the process of development as a developer, right, it is always suggested that you use one of the CSS frameworks that are available to you at your disposal. Learn one of the syntaxes of these frameworks, and then that will make your life much easier, the developer, in order to implement CSS concepts for your web pages, right? Thereafter, once you have taken care of structure and presentation, which is what HTML and CSS enables, then comes the requirements of making your web applications interactive, right? That it is not static in nature. That is, it's not just displaying some static information and the user does not have any capability to interact with it. So in order to implement this interactivity, the technology that is required is basically JavaScript, right? And the technology that is specific to UI development is known as vanilla JavaScript or plain JavaScript, essentially. So when you're learning JavaScript, essentially you will have to, if this is your first time, then you will have to learn about the basics of JavaScript as a programming language first, before you learn about the different concepts of JavaScript that is used for web page manipulation, right? And when it comes to basics of any programming language, you have to start from the very beginning, right? So that means you have to understand what is variables or how are variables declared in JavaScript. You have to learn about if-else statements, branching and control statements. You have to learn about functions. You have to learn about loops, just for loops, while loops, all of the basic things that you might be familiar with on with a different programming language. Let's say, for example, C++, Python, or Java. You have to learn that again, but this time using the syntax of JavaScript, right? You have to learn about arrays as well and stuff like that. And then once you learn the basics of JavaScript as a programming language, then you have to learn about how to use the aspects of JavaScript that is specifically used to embed interactivity into your UIs, right, or your user interfaces. So that is with respect to being able to manipulate what is known as the document object model. So the DOM stands for the document object model. So if you look at the picture to your right, essentially, this is how a web page is represented as a tree data structure, right? So that is the document object model, essentially represents a hierarchical structure which represents the entire web page. And this holds true for any kind of UI that you design. So at the very top, you have the page itself that is known as a document object, right? And within that, you have your root element, which is going to be HTML. And that has two main child elements. That is the head, which consists of all the metadata information of the page. That is information that describes what this page is about, what technology has been used, does it have any external libraries, what CSS files, JavaScript files are there, so on and so forth, title, information of the page, etc. And then the body, which essentially is composed of your content. That is the content that you as a developer want to convey to your users, right? So it consists of any kind of subjective information, starting from regular text to image elements to hyperreference elements such as links, multimedia, embedded information that goes within the body, right? So before you start coding, right, and this holds true for any kind of programming class that you do, right? It is always suggested that you draw out an algorithm, so to speak, or a blueprint or an idea of how the implementation is going to happen, right? The same holds true for web programming as well, or web development, right? So whenever you're trying to design your web page, whether it be the structure through HTML or interactivity through JavaScript, or even to a certain degree presentation as well, when we will learn more about this when we actually start learning about CSS, you have the tools at your disposal that allows you to kind of sketch out what your page is going to look like. And that makes your life easier when it comes to the implementation, because you use your sketch as a reference and then just implement it step by step using the syntax, right? So whenever it comes to learning these new programming technologies, right, these development technologies, your logic is what you should work towards sharpening, right? And syntax is something that you will learn through practice. The more you practice, the more you will understand about it, right? So one of the most important technologies, or one of the most important ways to kind of express your logic in this particular domain is to fully understand this document object model. It holds true for HTML. When you're starting HTML, you have to learn the DOM. And when it comes to JavaScript as well, and then using JavaScript to manipulate dynamically the different aspects of your UI, you still have to be able to learn the DOM, right? So we will be learning about the DOM, how to select different elements on the fly, and then how to manipulate that. So that means, how do you add dynamically new elements to your web page? How do you modify existing ones? How do you delete it, right? So the basic operations, if you're familiar with any of your data structure or algorithm classes that pertains to a tree, is like, oh, how do you insert an element into the tree? How do you update existing ones, delete existing nodes in the tree? It's the same thing, right? But in a different environment is what we are going to learn again. Okay, there are some higher order array methods. Okay, some methods that are optimized for functions that pertains to an array. So we are going to learn about the for each method, the map, the filter, the reduce method that makes life much easier when it comes to manipulating the DOM. Okay, we will also learn about what is known as JSON, that is known as the JavaScript object notation. It is a way of representing data, and it is one of the most popular ways in which data is represented and then transmitted from the front end to the back end, or the back end to the front end, right? So we're going to learn about the syntax of how to represent that, and then how to store our data like that, so that we are familiar with how to use JSON, and then how to transmit data by using the JSON format and not any other format, okay? And to a certain degree, since it is not a full stack development course, it's mostly about front-end development course, but we are still going to learn the basics of HTTP requests. And I'm going to talk about this towards the end of this particular video, a little bit more about what these API calls mean and what is the purpose of get, post, put, and delete. Okay, so once we are done with the three most important things that helps you create interactive front-end UI, there are some supporting tools that are necessary for you to make sure that you are able to manage your project that you're developing, right? So the first thing that you will need is basically version control. So you will need to know how to use Git. That is what we will be learning in this course. You will also need to know how to use a repository manager, an online repository manager that can be synced with Git. Okay, so the one that we'll be using for this course is the well-known one, that is GitHub. We also would need to implement or install different third-party packages and libraries for our project as we move forward in this course, right? So the two most well-known package managers that are out there is npm and then yarn, okay? Because we're working with JavaScript specifically. If it was Python and stuff like that, then we would have used pip and those kind of things, right? But npm and yarn is one of the well-known libraries, package managers, which can be used to install third-party libraries and stuff like that for JavaScript-based projects, right? There is also a concept of module bundler. We will discuss about module bundler more when we are learning, probably 2 months down the line, about React. So one of the better known module bundlers that are used for front-end React is Webpack. So we will discuss about that when we get to that point. So for now, this is mostly for information. Okay, so a lot of these might not make sense, these terminologies that I am discussing right now. So that is absolutely fine. You don't have to worry about it. What you have to understand is what exists out there, what is the background of this course, what are the different aspects that are involved, and to get an understanding of the big picture. That is, why are we learning the topics that we are learning, and then how is it going to be useful, right? What, once you learn those topics, what would you be able to do? That is what you need to know, right? And then you also need an editor, of course. As I discussed in the syllabus about the last video, the editor that I strongly recommend using is the Microsoft Visual Studio Code editor, right? And that editor has a lot of extensions in its marketplace, right? So with respect to indentation, code indentation, and documentation, not documentation, but mostly indentation, there is an extension called Prettier, right? So we would need to use those things. I will show you the installation of those extensions. We will also install several extensions that relates to each of these technologies, that gives us some support with respect to the syntax, right? And it helps and makes our life easier if you're learning these technologies for the first time, okay? So once these main technologies and supporting tools are covered, right? Again, just as you can optimize the process of writing CSS by using CSS framework, there are ways to optimize the process of JavaScript as well, right? And how do you manipulate the DOM and make your code more reusable, okay? Make it more decomposable and reusable, so to speak. So there are various front-end frameworks that are out there in the market, right? So for example, you have React, you have Vue, Angular, and Svelte, and stuff like that. But the most popular and the most common one that is right now being used in the market is basically React.js. Okay, it's a library. It's a front-end framework library that is an extension of JavaScript. It's built using JavaScript. And then with respect to React, there is also a requirement of state management. Okay, don't worry about what state management is. Basically, in short, on a very, very high level explanation, it is basically to keep a track of the value of the variables that are changing on your UI, right? And making sure that as these values change, you are able to render the new values, the updated values on your screen and show those changes to the user, okay? Later on, when we learn about React, we will realize that you cannot just simply store your values in variables like you are familiar with in typical programming languages, and then the updated value will simply be rendered back to the screen. When you use React, it doesn't work like that. So we need different ways, and those ways are known as state management, right? Because you're managing the state of a variable. And one of the external third-party applications that is responsible for performing what is known as global state management. There is internal ways of doing state management, but that is local. Okay, so if you are going to do global state management, then there is a third-party application that is known as Redux. So we're going to learn about Redux as well. So together it is known as React Redux, so to speak, for global state management. Okay, so that kind of covers everything there is, not everything, but the fundamentals of the technologies that is used for front-end development. So that means you need to first learn about the basics of structuring your web page, and then presentation that is done using HTML and CSS. And then in order to embed or incorporate interactivity, user interactivity, and dynamicness to your front-end UI frameworks, you need to know about JavaScript, and as I like to call it, vanilla JavaScript, for DOM manipulation and styling. And after that, in order to optimize the process of JavaScript development, you can use one of the front-end JS frameworks that are available, and the one that we are going to be using is React. And along with that, we will use the state management tool of Redux in order to keep a track of the values of the variables that are changing on our UI and make sure that it is rendered appropriately. Okay, so once that is done, the other side of the spectrum is basically backend development. So although the scope of this course is not consisting of backend development, you would still like to know that there are many various languages that can be used for backend development. Okay, so you have the options of what is known as Node.js, JavaScript-based, Dino, which is also JavaScript-based, or you can develop it using Python. You can develop it using C#, Golang, that's the Google's language, right? You have the options of more traditional and more popular languages like PHP is there, Ruby is there, and even Java can be used to develop or write your code for server-side or backend, right? So essentially, just as a suggestion, like if you're developing your front end using, let's say, JavaScript, and you're new to this domain, right? So rather than learning a technology every time you move from, let's say, front end to back end, it is better to have an extension of the same technology. So at least you understand the process of development and then kind of diversify from that point onwards, right? So Node.js is the best option when it comes to JavaScript-based backend languages, right? So that is something that you can keep in mind if ever in future you want to extend your skill set from front-end development to back-end development, and dip your toes into the domain of full stack developers. Then a good starting point after finishing this course is to basically pick up from Node.js for server-side development, right? And then there are also server-side frameworks. So that means once you learn the language that is used for server-side development, again, it's the same cycle, right? You learn the technology, then you learn how to optimize your process of development using a framework, okay? So the framework for Node.js is essentially one of the best ones is Express. You will find a lot of applications that is developed using Express. Similarly, if you are learning Python, then the frameworks that are available is Django or Flasks. And then PHP, you have Laravel, C# is ASP.NET and stuff like that. Java, there is Spring Model View Controller, Ruby on Rails, and all of these different technologies are there. So there's a lot that is out there in the market. What is essential is for you to pick one, start with one technology, get an understanding of the concepts and the domain, and then diversify from there onwards. Okay, so my suggestion typically, and all of these technologies have their own pros and cons, right? They're not suitable universally to build all type of application. Depending on the category of application and the type of functionality that is supposed, each of these technologies have its own pros and cons, specifically the backend technologies, right? So there is no logical extension that just because your front end is JavaScript, your backend also needs to be JavaScript, right? There is no established policy like that. Okay, so it's just that if you're new to this, right, and if you're interested in this, in order to minimize the number of new things that you need to absorb, the new languages that you have to learn every step of the way, then it is a logical extension that, okay, if you have already learned JavaScript and if you are sharpening your understanding of JavaScript as a language, then if you move to the server side, then better pick off from where you left it and use JavaScript and continue building your skill set in JavaScript and understand the whole development domain from there, right? So after that, there is also, as a full stack developer, the requirement for data management and data modeling. And when it comes to that, you need to know databases, right? So essentially, when it comes to databases, you need to know how to design your databases. You need to have an understanding of what a relational database is, what a non-relational database is, that is also known as NoSQL databases or schema-less databases. And you need to know how to query your databases using the structured query language, right? So that is the basis of querying any kind of database, whether it is relational or non-relational, it doesn't matter. So databases, you have a lot of different options. You have cloud-based database that is provided by Google, such as Firebase. You have databases and storage options with Amazon as well in the form of Amazon S3, Amazon's own relational databases, Microsoft's SQL Server, Oracle's MySQL, MongoDB is there. That is one of the more popular options when it comes to using NoSQL databases if you want to go that direction. And then you can also use Postgres as well if you want, right? So you can just make a list of it. That is, if you ever are interested in pursuing this domain after you have finished this course, then these are some of the options to make that logical jump and try these technologies out, okay? And then finally, once everything is done, that is, once a full stack is developed, the next important thing is how do you deploy that? How do you deploy your web application? Okay, the deployment for mobile application is a little bit, tad bit different because you have to publish that in one of the app stores where users can access and download it from, right? But web apps, it's not published in any kind of store, right? It needs to be hosted by a platform. So there are many different options that are there when it comes to hosting your full stack of web systems. So you can use what is known as the Heroku. DigitalOcean is there, or you can use one of the popular cloud services that are out there in the form of AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud Platform. Okay? If you're hosting it by yourself, which kind of increases the overhead of making sure your servers are running, you have to keep your machines on all the time. It introduces additional overhead and bottlenecks with respect to the management and maintenance of your application. But if that's the route that you want to take, then you have the options of using Apache, NGINX, and stuff like that. You can also, if you're familiar with these terms, deploy your applications within containers, such as Docker. And then there are different ways to store your videos and then kind of create a content delivery network in the form of using Amazon's S3 and stuff like that. Or you can improve the process of development by using these concepts of DevOps, okay, or development operations. That is essentially a subset of automation by using continuous integration and continuous delivery and deployment, right? So in short, it is known as CI/CD. So again, you don't have to, these things don't need to make sense. This is just to give you an idea of what is out there and basically the roadmap of what different elements of this entire domain consists of, okay? So the final thing is once you learn the web development process, front end, if and later on back end and databases and stuff like that, you can extend that knowledge to mobile development. Okay, so everything that you have learned in mobile development can be extended depending on the technology that you're using. Your life may be limited to extending what you have already learned versus having to learn a new language altogether, right? So if you just want to learn, say, for example, iOS mobile app development, right? That's, you know, that's all you're going to do. That's all you want to learn, right? So then you can choose to learn a language that is specific to iOS development. So you will have to learn the environment. You'll have to learn a completely new language in the form of Swift, right? So similarly, if you say that, oh, I want to learn just Android development, then there's a language that is specific to Android development, that is Kotlin, right? But if you want to have a knowledge of cross-platform app development, that is, what it means by that is that, okay, you're just going to focus on developing the app and not worry about the platform on which it will be deployed, that is Android, iOS, or web platform. Then the options is in the form of Flutter or Dart, and then you also have the options of React Native, which is also a JavaScript-based library, and that is what we are going to be covering in this course, because we don't want to, again, introduce a new language, because we are already learning about like 3 new technologies, if you count HTML, CSS, and then JavaScript, and then the 2 libraries that are there. So React Native is one of the technologies that are there for front-end mobile UI development that is kind of platform independent, or as we say, it has cross-platform support. That is, you write your app using React Native, and then once you deploy it, depending on whether it is an iOS, Android, or a web platform, the package, basically the bundler, which we talked about here somewhere, will essentially figure out how to render your application so that it kind of abides by the syntaxes of that particular platform, right? So what I mean by that is later on when we get to mobile development towards the end of the course, you will realize that there is no HTML in front-end development of native apps or what is known as mobile apps, right? So we have to use different set of tags or markups in order to make the iOS, and iOS uses its own set of markups, Android uses its own set of markups, right? So instead of learning markups for every platform, right, we learn the markups that is provided by the React Native library itself, right? And then the bundler is, depending on the platform where you kind of host it, will be able to translate that markup that you have written in React Native to the corresponding markup of the platform that the platform recognizes, right? So that is why we are going to learn about this React Native library, but these are the different options that are there. And we will discuss these options again when we start talking about React Native in module 5, okay? So although this is the domain of web and mobile development, and then just a quick note, the backend side is to a certain degree will be similar to what you use for web applications as well when you're working with mobile applications. That doesn't change, right? It's just the UI development changes, okay? So other than this, other than web development topics, you still must make sure, even if you're pursuing a career or if you're interested in going a little bit more deeper in this particular domain, whenever it comes to development, whenever it comes to programming, you need to have a pretty strong grasp on these two subjects in front of your screen, right? So you must make sure that you are proficient in algorithm design and analysis, because that is going to improve your logical and critical thinking. And that is very much important if you are going to pursue a job prospect as a software developer or as a software engineer, right? It is very, very important. If you're going for any kind of development roles, you need to be very strong with algorithm design and analysis, and you need to have a good knowledge of the different data structures that are out there, right? So these are the two subjects you need to make sure that, I believe all of you at this point of time, those who are enrolled in this course, have taken these two courses. So if there's ever a need to revise it, that time is now, right? So please make sure that you sharpen your skill set when it comes to data structures, when it comes to algorithm design and analysis. Because if your logic and your understanding of data structure is good, then working with these new technologies, establishing the logic and the blueprint of how or what you're trying to develop will be much easier, right? And then the syntax will come to you based on the practice. As you do more, you will get more used to it. As you face and encounter more bugs, you will become better and better, okay? So how this course is designed is basically into 5 different modules, right? So each of these different modules, the first module is with respect to the content and structuring of web systems, okay? And then the presentations of web systems, specifically all related to front-end UI development, okay? There is no back-end business, there is no database business that are involved here, okay? However, what I will show you is that even when you finish the front-end development, then how to expose your front-end and how to work with the resources that will be exposed by the backend, and then integrate it to create this complete cycle, this complete full stack cycle that we talked about a little bit earlier, right? So the first module is about content and structuring. The second module will be about presentation, and then of course, how to optimize the code for implementing presentation. Then how to make your interfaces, your UIs, more dynamic in nature, how to manipulate them, and then how to incorporate user interaction, how to allow users to interact with your UI that you create. Then the fourth module will be to optimize the process of making your UIs dynamic and incorporating user interactions. And then finally, we will wrap this course up with mobile UI development, okay? And in order to do that, the first module, the technology that we are going to learn for content and structuring, is basically HTML5, the most recent version of HTML. For presentation, we're going to be learning about cascading style sheets 3, version 3, or CSS3. And then to optimize the development process of CSS, we are going to be learning about this particular framework for CSS that is known as Tailwind CSS, okay? For dynamic and user interactions to be present in your web applications, we will learn JavaScript as a programming language first, and then we will learn about vanilla JavaScript without any additional add-ons as to how JavaScript can be used to manipulate our UIs, and then how it can incorporate user interaction. Then to optimize the process of dynamic user interactions, we will then learn about React.js, the library. In addition to that, there are some important aspects of React.js that is known as the React router, that is essentially used for navigations in React apps. Okay, and we're going to be learning about React Router 6, which is the version that we are working with right now. And then for global state management, we will be introducing ourselves to React Redux, the concept, the technology of React Redux. Okay, and then finally, when we go to mobile UI development, we are going to be learning about the technology of React Native, the library of React Native. React Native is not an extension of React.js. It has its own components and syntaxes to learn, but it does borrow a lot of the other functionalities from React itself. So for example, state management is still done through React Redux, right? But for example, you can use React Router for mobile, but there is a different stack navigation, native stack navigation that is there. And we're going to learn all about this when we get to the mobile development. We're going to learn about how to make API calls. So this is basically how you are going to learn how to connect your front-end frameworks with any kind of backend, okay? Whether that is written by you or that is a third-party API call that you are making. So for example, we will learn about how to integrate some of the APIs that is given as a service by Google, right, in the form of Google Maps, Google Autocomplete, Google Places API, distance matrix API, and those kind of things, right? So we will learn about how to integrate that to our mobile application when it comes to mobile UI development. Okay, so the demos, in order to learn while we are learning all of these technologies in each of these 5 modules that we will cover, is when it comes to structuring, we will first of all learn about the various HTML elements. Okay, there is nothing too complicated when it comes to HTML. Even if you're new to this, you will learn about this. So don't worry too much, at least for HTML as such, right? So we will learn about how to structure our text, how to structure any kind of multimedia information, whether that is images, audio files, video files, embedding other video files on our web page and stuff like that, how to incorporate hyperreferences, how to write down a list, and then the important thing is how to work with semantic tags, right? As I discussed, that not everybody will be able to visually access the information that you present with your UI, right? So keeping accessibility in mind, there will be some users who might be using assistive reader technologies, that what it does is basically it reads the web page out back to the user, right? And when it reads the web page, it just doesn't read the content of your web page, but also the structure of your web page that you have developed using HTML, right? So it is very important that when we structure our web page, we use meaningful tags. So the assistive reading devices can actually tell the users that this is an image, this is what the image title is, right? And this is a link that is given, and so on and so forth, right? So more information will follow when we actually get to this point and start discussing about this. But essentially what you have to remember is most of HTML is about making sure that you just are not just putting content on your page, but putting it in a meaningful way such that you keep accessibility in mind. We will learn about how to structure tables, buttons, and input tags, so to speak. For web page presentation, we will learn about navbar designs. There are different ways to design your navbar, and that is one of the most important aspects on any UI navigation, right? How do you move from one page to other page? So in presentation, we are going to be discussing about how do you present the different forms of navigation that are out there, right? So do you do a horizontal bar? Do you do a vertical navigation bar? Like, do you put a sticky navigation bar? How to highlight the active tabs in the navigation bar and stuff like that, how to provide different types of animation on your navigation bars, or even on your web page, so to speak, and stuff like that, in the form of pseudo classes and pseudo elements and so on and so forth, right? How to style your text, how to style your fonts, right? How to take care of layout, alignment, positioning with the help of different CSS concepts such as Flexbox, right? CSS grids, and so on and so forth. For dynamic interaction, we will mostly be focusing about the manipulation of the DOM, right? How do you update existing elements on your web page, add new elements on the fly, remove elements on the fly, and so on and so forth. How do you take care of different user events, such as if a user clicks a mouse button, right? How do you keep a track of that, and how do you make changes as a result of that? If the user types something on the keyboard, how do you collect that data? So those are what user events basically means, right? So we're going to learn about that. And the two major demos that we will be covering when we get to this point is basically how to develop a simple calculator app that's the starting point of any JavaScript project. And then a little bit more complex, going from beginner to intermediate level, we will be doing a quiz app, which will be a clone of Kahoot, right? So if you're familiar with the Kahoot application that is out there, if you have ever used it before, so we're going to develop a quiz app. And when we move forward, right, we are going to be revising everything we have done previously as well, right? So that means anything that we have done before, we are going to be covering it in the next modules, in the next demos as well, to as much degree as we can. Okay, so we keep on, so we don't forget what we have done before, right? And we keep on revising and practicing everything that we have done before as well. When we get to React, we are going to be doing an Airbnb clone, okay? Not the entirety of the Airbnb website, but specifically the online experiences page. Or if you're familiar with the Airbnb interface, when you go to Airbnb, essentially what you can do is you can search for things to do in a place that you're visiting. So that particular interface is what we are going to be cloning. And why we want to do that, because one of the most important design aspects of user interfaces that a lot of websites uses, actually like majority, I can to a certain degree say 99% of the websites use, YouTube uses it, Amazon, Walmart, name it, they use it. It is known as cards, okay, UI cards. So the process of implementing cards is much easier if we use a library such as React. And it also exposes us to some of the core concepts of React itself, right? Why we should use React. That is kind of elucidated or expanded upon when we learn the implementation of cards, right? So in order to do that, we are going to clone the Airbnb online experiences part of the UI. We are also going to learn about different elements such as the hero page or the hero elements through React. We are also going to learn about how to implement single page view apps. That is what React specializes in, okay? And that's what gives your app this snappy feeling, that it does not reload the entire web page every time you go from one page to the other or you change something on your page. It only re-renders the things that have changed on the page, right? So you can search and you can find that there is this concept called a single page view app, and that is the specialty of React, right? So in order to implement that, we cannot use typical navigation structures that we use for when we do basic HTML and JavaScript, right? So for that navigation, we are going to be using the React router for web browsers, right? So we're going to learn about that. And then finally, we will move on to mobile development. And the first thing is I will start with an intermediate to higher difficulty demo, which is a clone of Uber app, ride sharing app, right? And through that, we are going to learn about how to make API calls, how to integrate things like Google Maps API, Google Places API, the distance matrix API, and also perform state management with React Native. And once we learn that, we will essentially cover all of the core functionalities of React Native, okay, through that particular demo. And then to revise that, we are going to be doing a simple task app where you can create a task, delete a task, so on and so forth, okay. So this is essentially all of the different topics that we are going to cover. So in conclusion, these are all the different things that we were going to cover. So I hope that makes sense, okay. If you did not understand some of these terminologies, again, I repeat, it's absolutely fine. What is important for you is to be mindful about what we are going to be covering and why we are going to be covering. So the two important things that you need to know is basically this slide and these topics that will be covered, right? So this is what are we going to cover in this course, and then how are we going to cover these topics. And then if you're interested in exactly how you are going to cover these topics in a little bit more detail, by what kind of exercises and demos and concepts that we're going to learn about. And of course, this is not a comprehensive list. Then you can make a note of it. Okay? There's no need to memorize anything. So in conclusion, what is important is, since this course is about front-end development, there's always a question about, so how do I work with the backend if I ever reach to that point? If I don't know backend development, how should I work, right? So just to give you a quick idea what is important, and how this course does not leave you hanging in that aspect, is that most of the full stack apps that are developed right now, whether it is using a mobile UI, native UI, or a web UI, is through what is we call as RESTful API calls, right? REST stands for representational state transfer. You don't have to learn the whole thing right now. But what happens is that whenever you develop a resource in the backend, right, it could be developed by you, and that becomes your server, or it could be developed by some third party, then it becomes a third party API call, right? So these calls are done using RESTful API calls, okay, or API calls. And whenever you have a fully functional full stack app, that is, you're dealing with data, right, there are four main functions that your app needs to support when it works with handling data, right? The storage, the modification of data. So that is given by this acronym that is known as CRUD. So if you look at the first letters of these four sentences, that is the acronym that refers to the functionality that a full stack app needs to support when it works with data. So you can have create. Okay, so you're creating new data entries. Let's say you're creating a user, or you have read. Okay, where you are just trying to, let's say, access the list of data or the list of products that is there on a website, or you're updating a user entry that already exists. So let's say you log in, and then you are trying to update your address for an entry that already exists on the database. And then finally, let's say if you are quitting that particular service, then you're deleting your user profile. So that's the And for each of these four operations, there is a corresponding API call, HTTP API call, right? So HTTP is the protocol using which the client and the server communicates with each other, right? And depending on the type of communication that is taking place, there is a corresponding API call that needs to be implemented, okay? So, and this goes for your back-end development specifically, not your front-end development. For your front-end development, you always need to make the call, okay, or basically make these one of these HTTP requests. But to develop and implement this and then expose the resources such that when the call is being made, what do you do after that? That is a responsibility of back-end development, right? So if you're working with create, that is, if you're trying to insert new data, then the HTTP call that corresponds to it is known as post, okay? And it is in all caps. The read is get. When you try to update, you're either using put, or sometimes, in some instances, you might also see patch. And when you're sending a put request, that when you're trying to update something, you need to send that request with an ID, such that the backend can actually locate what are you trying to update. Okay, read can read everything, and you can add filters on top of that. Create, you get the new data and it gets created. Same goes for delete as well. So the corresponding HTTP call, API call is delete, and that needs to go with an ID. Because if you don't send an ID with delete, we all know what's going to happen, and that is not something that you want to implement or allow, because that can lead to accidental deletion of your entire data storage. Okay, and the way that HTTP request response works is through the cycle that we call the HTTP request response cycle. So that means every time a client wants something in the form of one of these four operations, then it's going to send this HTTP request to the server. Now, the server can be written by you. When it is written by you, basically it becomes your backend, or it could be to some other third-party API, right? It could be maintained by Google or some other platform that is actually maintaining the server. So that's when we say third-party API calls, all right? So you send an HTTP request. In the HTTP request, you specify what type of request are you sending? Are you sending create, read, update, or delete request, right? And then along with that, you provide with the other parameters that is there. That is, if you want to provide an ID, and so on and so forth, if you want to send your username and password and stuff like that. So this is all wrapped in a data packet and goes with this HTTP request. It is then received by the server only if there is a resource that is exposed by the server to the client to make that request. Okay, so that means the server exposes these different endpoints, which is identified by URLs. Every time you go to a web browser, in the URL, you type an address, right? Why do you get something back? Because on that server, there is a resource that is the complete URL. So if I say Amazon.com, that is where the server is running. Okay, then / if I write electronics/tablet, then that is a resource of a page that will be sent back to the client. So when I type that in the browser from the client, that request is being received by the server because the server has created this endpoint to receive that particular URL, right? So once the server receives the request, it unpacks that packet, right? Checks what the client wants to do. And then there is a logic in the form of, let's say, for the sake of discussion, of a function that has been implemented. So the body of that function is executed when the server realizes that the client has requested this. Okay. And then whatever, after the execution of that body, whatever the resulting package is, right? It could be, let's say, a date. So let's say if the user has sent a GET request, that is a read request, of all of the different iPads that are available on Amazon.com, right? So Amazon has already exposed that endpoint. It receives the request, executes the function with respect to the read request, brings all the data together, okay, which is a list of all of the devices, maybe from the database, and then sends that back within a packet that is known as HTTP response. All right, so all of this discussion, what it leads to essentially is when you're just working on this client side, you need to know how to make these API calls to receive the data. And then once you receive the data, everything else comes back to the front end side. Then it is all about displaying that data. So everything you have learned till before that, you're going to follow the same steps. All right. So if you're just a developer who specializes in front end, then the back end developers are going to give you these endpoints, right? And you need to develop your front end by using these endpoints, using different methods. So there are methods that can do these API calls. So for example, there is a method called fetch, you have Axios, and so on and so forth, in order to make these read requests and stuff like that. But the same goes for the other requests as well. All you need to do is use the correct HTTP request, okay? And you will get a response from the server as long as that endpoint exists, right? So your job as a front-end developer is to have some basic understanding on how these HTTP request response works and what is the purpose of each of them, and how to make an API call from your front-end UI, okay? And that basically connects this side, and the rest will be taken care of whoever is responsible for the back-end development. It could be you, it could be somebody else, depending on how do you want to specialize yourself. Okay, so essentially this is what the course is about. Just to make a quick recap, there are 5 modules. Everything is with respect to front-end UI development for web and mobile systems. We're going to learn about the content and structuring of web systems, presentation of web systems, how to make your UIs dynamic and incorporate user interaction on it, optimize the process of development by learning different JavaScript frameworks, like not different, but learning a JavaScript framework, which is React.js, and then to develop UI for your mobile platform, which is also known as native platform, by learning another library, which is an extension of JavaScript that is known as React Native. That is built, not an extension, but that is built using JavaScript technology, that is React Native. Okay. So I will stop the screen recording and this particular video here itself. From the next video, we are actually going to start learning about the first module, which is content and structuring. That is HTML5. Okay, so take care and bye-bye.